Welcome to an inspiring conversation with Marwa Zahr, implementation and practitioner lead at World Child Alliance and laureate of the 2024 Eden Prize for Education Development. Growing up in Lebanon, Marwa witnessed how conflict and crisis disrupt children's education, which profoundly shaped her personal mission to support those most at risk. Today, as a leader within the innovative Can't Wait to Learn program, she brings digital education to places where schools and teachers are often unavailable, and children need flexible support that offers hope and develops their potential. Meeting Marwa is a unique opportunity to hear how true change emerges, where resources are scarce and stereotypes about education are strong. Join me in a reflection on education, motivation, and peace in some of the world's most challenging places. Marwa, you grew up in Lebanon, surrounded by conflict and crisis. Was there a moment in your life, maybe as a child or teenager or teacher, when you realized education is not a luxury, but an act of resistance, an act of hope?
Yes, of course. I think that this moment even started before my own story. It started with my mother's, and it's the first time I'm sharing this story. Back in 1981, when my mother was in grade 9, war reached her village. And she narrates for us how she remembers the sounds of planes before the bombing, how her classroom windows would rattle, how overnight her classmates and teachers didn't show up again. And that's when my grandparents decided to send her to Beirut, which was considered to be a safer area back then. But this meant that she never returned to school. And 3 years later, she was married to my father, not walking into a classroom, but rather walking into motherhood. In a very short period, then, when my brother was 8 months old, there was phosphoric bombing in the area where we lived. And she tells us how she had to wrap him when he was affected by the phosphoric bombing and rushed to the hospital with my father. She often said that her greatest loss wasn't safety or money, it was her education. And that loss brought her motivation. That's how she became determined that my brother and I would never stop learning, no matter what happened around us. And I carried that belief to my own life. During the 2006 Israeli Defense Force attacks, I was in high school. The windows shook the same way my mother described them, and the fear was familiar, only this time it was my experience. And almost 20 years later, just last year, the same story repeated itself. I was taking university courses when the attacks on Lebanon began again. On my drives to Beirut, I never knew if a drone would hit a car nearby. Our classes were interrupted by air raid sounds, and yet students kept showing up, determined, refusing to surrender normal life. And I've seen that again and again, the same courage in Syrian refugee children, learning in tents, eager and full of hope. And one thing that a girl shared with me, and I'd never forget, is that when she can read, no one can lie to her, right? So education isn't luxury for children. It's how they fight back quietly and rebuild hope.
But one thing that comes to my mind when you describing this situation is how can you, education is mainly associated with focus, with silence. How can you even think about learning when everything's around is crazy and you're not safe?
See, this is what many people say, and this is a frequent question that we get. But children who used to go to school and have their own desks and sit in this classroom, They're surrounded by their classmates, by the teacher. That's a routine, right? And when you bring it back to them, you're bringing to them a sense of normalcy amid the whole chaos that they are living in. And we've heard that from children, we've heard it from teachers, we've heard it from parents asking us, even during war, the first question would be, when will our children go back to school? And you would see all the initiatives that would come from parents. You would see one mother sharing her phone with another so that children can access Can't Wait to Learn, for example, and many other examples that come from the field and that support this idea.
When I was preparing to this interview, I found out that you mentioned one of the most common misconceptions is that children's needs in conflict are limited to food and shelter. But in my society, where I speak around about education, there's another myth that people in those regions affected by crisis, like they don't want to change and don't want to learn and grow. That's what I've heard. Is this image true, or where does this image may come from?
Yeah. I think that image that people in conflict don't want to learn or change comes from distance. It's easy to hold that belief when you only see headlines of war, which are sometimes presented in misleading way through news, but you're not seeing like the small acts of courage that happen every day in between. So to me, yes, it is a misconception. Of course, need shelter, need food, these are basic needs, but of course, other needs are being overlooked, like their need of sense of normalcy, which education brings in. I've seen this over and over again. As I just mentioned, parents asking us when will their children go back to schools, how they collaborated together, making sure that children can attend remote sessions. Even last year in Lebanon, we saw children still walking to schools during the first weeks of bombing. And even when they returned to their shattered homes and scarred neighborhoods, the first thing that many did was re-enrolling in schools and universities. That simple act, choosing to learn amid destruction, was their way of saying we're still here and we believe in tomorrow. So people in conflict aren't resistant to change. They're actually resisting despair. And what I've witnessed is an incredible hunger for children and these communities to grow and find purpose again.
It seems to me impossible to cope with. Like, if you think about most of people's jobs that they are doing daily, they think like they are having problems, like the word is like difficult. And how about your work? It seems like you are wearing a heavy burden on you. How do you cope with that, or how do you deal with that? Or maybe it grows you, helps you like flourish.
It is indeed, to me, working, whether that's in my community or in other communities, with the children, with caregivers and teachers who are affected by conflict and by war, similar to the situation that I grew through. That actually gives me a lot of hope and motivation. It is something I promised myself to do and will continue to do. These small interactions and reactions that you get from children, from the teachers, that if at one moment you think that you are tired or that this is overwhelming, it just gives you the push to move forward and even to do more.
And is it only for learning the basics? Is all of what you said true only for the basic skills like maths or learning or reading, or is it true also for, I don't know, the university level education?
Are you referring here to Can't Wait to Learn or about the concept in general?
I mean the concept in general.
Of course, it applies for both. I mean, with the children, especially those affected by conflict, when you're giving them a basic education and they're literate, they're able to read, they are numerate, you are giving them agency to decide about their future. As this little girl said to me, no one can lie to them, right? And with university students, I mean, these are the foundation. for any change that we would look at. I know that education won't stop conflict and wars, but it will also change this stigma about normalizing it when you have educated communities, especially with the youth.
So it sort of becomes a weapon.
Indeed, indeed.
Mm.
It is a weapon, and this is a strong weapon with a longer term impact.
Yeah, I love the long term effects of education, especially. Right, but let's veer a little bit into can't wait to learn. You use tablets with educational games in 8 countries, very different cultural contexts. Could you share an example of a universal educational solution? What was challenged by a local children or communities?
Yes. One of Can't Wait to Learn's strongest USPs is that it's contextualized and co-created locally across the 8 countries. So our approach is global, but every version of the game is built locally through the co-creation process. Children, teachers, local artists, they designed the storylines, the visuals, and the characters that reflect the realities of children. At the same time, we work hand in hand with ministries of education to make sure that every level matches the national curriculum. For example, in Uganda, we worked with the National Curriculum Development Center on aligning and mapping the game to the learning objectives for primary 1 to 3. In Ukraine, now we're in the process of a full handover to the Ministry of Education and Science by around mid. But to be fair, the real lesson in universal design came from context. For example, in several African countries where we couldn't have implemented Can't Wait to Learn without solar panels. So we had to adapt the hardware model. In Ukraine, we couldn't have reached children inside and outside the country if we haven't done the online distribution and the device agnosticity.
Okay.
In Uganda and Chad, you would find in one classroom over 100 children. So we introduced, for example, a group-based model. So every child could participate even with limited tablets. So when asked by people if we faced resistance, I'd say yes, but it's the kind of resistance that strengthens us. Ministries push us to stay rigorous and push us to stay authentic.
That's a very hard problem to solve when you have like the one application and you have to have the same good experience for people offline, online, working solo and in groups. How do you solve that in terms of like product management or user experience? Do you work with UX designers or you do it like from the user's feedback? How you approach that?
Yeah. All the developments that we've done in Can't Wait to Learn have come from the feedback over years. That's more than 15 years by now, mainly from children, from teachers, partners, ministries we have partnered with. That's how we've done the iterations, and that's how we made it context specific. So similar to the examples I just gave, in Ukraine, it was not possible only to have it in schools or in learning centers or in shelters. At one point, it had to be at household level with support from caregivers. Where possible, in shelters, it was done with a group, with a mentor who would follow up with the children and who would support them. Same case in Lebanon, it's done in learning centers, but also during COVID, for instance, it was through WhatsApp groups with a facilitator who communicates with the children, but makes sure that they can still access the content. So it's really case by case, but the more the project is agile, which is the case with Can't Wait to Learn, the more you can address the different needs and the different contexts.
I guess it's not only in situations of crisis, but it's a general problem of edtech solutions that we have served so many different cultural zones and different curricula and so on, that it's the agility you mentioned is maybe crucial for every solution. So if you could like maybe expand anything a little bit about how do you achieve this kind of ability, like technical wise and maybe organizational wise, because I guess your processes must have been adjusted to that, and maybe that's your mindset simply.
Yes, maybe if I share with you how Can't Wait to Learn started, actually that will feed into this question. When we started in Sudan, the main idea was to address the question whether digital personalized learning would support children's learning outcomes. And it was tested in Sudan with the Ministry of Education, with UNESCO and Hafad University. And it was a small pilot with the math game, and it was relevant to the Sudan context. And by the end of the pilot, the answer was yes, digital personalized learning supported children's learning and it increased the learning outcomes. And then we started replicating that from one country to another, but still in each country, it was a different context, right? So what the approach that we've taken through co-creation, local co-creation, and through working with ministries, doing the contextualization and the distribution models that work in this context, that's what helped us make it through in all these countries and helped us with the expansion and with the scalability. Because never one solution fits all. We always had to explore different ways and different solutions. Our partners on field, people from the ministries who supported our work, they were a great asset. They provided us with feedback with what works well, with what doesn't work well. We've never worked towards parallel response to the governmental educational policies. It was always to support that, right? We don't want to create parallel systems, but support the existing systems. An example of that is Ukraine, which I just provided. Another is in Uganda, where we started with one district and now we're expanding hopefully across the whole country. And that's in line with the Ugandan digital education policy.
I find that entrepreneurs that have to work with governmental bodies of any kind, even if in countries without a ongoing conflict, that's a very tough thing to do. Is it any easier in the countries where they at war, or even harder?
It's always challenging, never easy.
Never easy.
Yeah, but really, when you bring actors together, when you look at the needs, it's not about designing solutions, one big universal solution that we assume that it would respond to the needs or to the needs in a certain context. What we really need to look at is what this specific community lacks and work towards the solution. And you would never know this if you don't work with the local authorities, because this is how you can ensure sustainability of the program. We don't also want to come and do short-term programs and enroll children, and after that, it's over. We want a solution that stays within the hands of the government that they can use and sustain on the longer run. Again, that's not an easy thing to do, but when you are aligned with the priorities, especially with the ministries of education, and when you bring together the solution that you have and adapt it to the needs that are communicated in this specific context, it works. It needs a lot of time. It needs a lot of efforts and iterations, but it works. With Can't Wait to Learn, we say that we've moved from innovation to integration within the government systems. It's already the case in Ukraine, in Uganda, soon in Lebanon. It is the case in Jordan. And we're looking forward to have that in the other countries as well.
So what happens with children when the program ends? Is the change in skills, resilience, and hope lasting, or do students revert to their previous lives when funding runs out?
Yeah, so that's a question we often ask ourselves because the real success isn't when a child finishes the game, but when learning continues after we leave. The skills that children build, whether that's in reading, math, or the confidence that they build, stays with them. But what truly lasts is the mindset, the belief that they can learn. And when everything around them feels uncertain, they know that they have the foundations and they have the hope. We've seen this again and again, teachers reporting how children who started Can't Wait to Learn become peer mentors later, supporting other children to read. Parents have noticed shifts in motivation and behavior. So even when learning cycles end, what remains is the learner's self-belief and the local capacity and resources that we've built to sustain learning, especially with
So you are like pushing the first domino.
Exactly, exactly.
So it sounds like you have an exit strategy, not to leave the children in an educational vacuum. Can you expand a little bit on what you do to help local communities take full ownership of the program?
I would rather call it a sustainability strategy rather than an exit strategy. The goal is never dependency. Can't Wait to Learn is a platform and not a project. So we don't end the programs, we do transfer them. When you build capacity with ministries, as I just emphasized, with local NGOs and with teachers themselves, they can integrate the platform into their systems. And that's always supported by rigorous research and evidence. For example, in Uganda, after we've done the randomized control trial in 2022 in governmental schools in a district called Isingiro, we did a full handover to the government, to the local district government in Isingiro. And now they are in charge of managing planning, data collection, and reporting. Each transition is different, but the goal is the same, that one day we are no longer needed for it to continue. It's with the communities.
It's great for building communities, but it's very bad for a business model, isn't it?
I mean, here we should go back to the Can't Wait to Learn vision, which is leaving no child behind and providing children with quality education, no matter where, no matter what. When we are doing these steps and when you are ensuring through community ownership that Can't Wait to Learn is reaching more and more children and you're giving equitable opportunities to children, that's the ultimate goal. And that's how we can expand and scale and even then think of other contexts and areas where Can't Wait to Learn can be of benefit.
And maybe imagining the world when every war will end and know of Words Corner, there is a crisis that's of any kind. Will your tool be still useful, or I'm trying to ask, in other words, are you trying also with other markets or only those with crisis conflicts? Like, sort of, are you focusing on the mission, or you have like the business goals as well somewhere?
It's both. I wouldn't say the business goals, but would rather say, however, Can't Wait to Learn can support children's learning and can support the learning outcomes, then it should be there to serve. Actually, in Jordan, for instance, there's no conflict. Jordan hosts a huge number of refugees, that's right. But now we work with the Minister of Education and the Queen Rania Center. Recently, we've launched a progressive web app. It would be available as one of the ministry's official resources. Where Can't Wait to Learn can be used as a supplementary tool in governmental schools. In Lebanon, it's the same. Apart from non-formal education, there's an MOU that's on the way with the Ministry of Education and Higher Education to implement it in formal schools as well. It's the plan also in other countries. Can't Wait to Learn is a tool. And the idea is to respond again to needs and to support children's learning, whether that's in conflict-affected settings or in a country where Can't Wait to Learn can improve children's learning outcomes. At the end, it's a digital personalized learning platform. It's co-created locally and it's aligned with the national curriculum. So it fits well as well in education.
Okay. Thank you. That was a complex question and multifaceted, but you answered to the point. Thank you. Well,
I'd like to add one more thing.
Go on.
One main component also is costing. You can never scale an edtech platform if there's no rigorous work around costing, right? So in Can't Wait to Learn, we have done many value for money analysis. Rigorous work around that. So we know now that the games are affordable and we know that they can fit in within the governmental and the ministry's budget planning so that we can again ensure that the program is sustainable and we can ensure equitable opportunities for children.
I'm glad that you mentioned that because that's one of my concerns. I know that you can have a mission and That's important why you do what you do. And on the other hand, you have to have resources to do that. And things that you mentioned already are very expensive, like creating games, applications, online, offline distribution, and all those sort of things you mentioned are very cost hungry, let's say. And you somehow manage that. So that's impressive work, I would say. Let's move on. I wanted to ask you about technology inequalities. Access to technology is unequal. That's a thing we know. How do you ensure that can't wait to learn doesn't deepen the digital divide, but actually reaches the most marginalized child?
Well, the digital divide is real. But for Can't
Mhm,
Wait to Learn, it's exactly where our work begins, not where
mhm,
it ends. So the platform was built for low resource, low connectivity environments. The game runs completely offline in some contexts, so children can learn anywhere in a settlement, a village, or a remote school with no internet. In many African contexts, we introduced the solar-powered learning kits to ensure that even when there's no electricity, learning doesn't stop. Even in Chad, for example, community members made use of the solar panels. They would come to the center after the learning sessions to charge their phones or make use of the solar power. Another example from Lebanon is how tablets were brought to the informal tented settlements.
mhm.
In some areas, girls were not allowed to leave the informal tented settlements and go to learning centers. So that's when Can't Wait to Learn was brought into their tents, ensuring that they have access to education.
Mhm.
However, access isn't only about devices, it's
Mhm.
also about inclusion and sustainability. That's why, as I emphasized, from the design, Can't Wait to Learn is designed through governments, and ministers of education are not just stakeholders, they are co-owners of the platform. Also, again, cost here plays a major role. So, in a nutshell, the goal isn't to deliver tablets or apps, it's really to improve learning outcomes
Mhm.
sustainability through tools that can live inside the system long after we leave.
And that's not an easy task.
Never.
Never. Moving forward, last year and this year, recruitment of children by armed groups has increased, and attacks on schools have become even more frequent. Faced with this scale of violence, our educational programs, like what we've just spoke about, just a band-aid? Or, well, I'm trying to ask, well, like, shouldn't we deploy the resources and the energy that you have, for example, and people around you have? Shouldn't we deploy that to fighting the root cause of those crises, or maybe like focusing on the education?
Yeah, I deeply understand this question, but when a child in crisis learns to read, they reclaim agency.
Mhm,
See, when schools are bombed and children are recruited by armed groups, teaching them to read can seem small, but
mhm,
for those children themselves, learning is an act of survival. It keeps their minds alive even when the world tells them to give up, whether it's directly or indirectly.
mhm.
So, education, as I said at the beginning, may not stop violence, but it prevents the next generation from normalizing it. And that's not a band aid, that's prevention at its most.
Because the one objection that could be raised is that you somehow legitimize conflicts, like you're making it a normal, like you, oh, right, there is a conflict, there is a war, like, but you go to school and learn.
Yeah, I hear this point. To be realistic, and from someone who comes from a conflict, from area which is affected by conflict, there are things that you can do, and there are things that are beyond what you can do.
Mhm,
So, in the meantime, whatever actions that can be done to bring normalcy into children's lives, that should be done. Because if we look at the trauma and the impact of conflict and war on children, whether during that's beyond description. Again, these may be small acts, but to children, they bring them a feeling of safety. I still experience that. I shared the example of how last year when I was enrolled in some courses at the university and I was a student back in this classroom, and being surrounded by my classmates, having the professors around, it was to me a sense of normalcy amid all what's been happening.
But it was needed. I understand that. And thank you for this answer, because these are not easy questions. And another difficult one. Will child receive support from Western governments and international organizations, and does funding from the global north affect which conflict gets attention and which children are prioritized? And maybe second part of the question, how do you handle potential conflict of interest?
It's true that a lot of our funding comes from donors in the global north, but our priorities are really shaped by need and not geography. Each country's work plan is usually co-developed with national partners, and decisions on where to expand are based on data like learning poverty rates, conflict impact, local demand. Also, we're transparent with donors about it. They support Can't Wait to Learn precisely because it's led by local ministries and not dictated externally. So, in addition to that, we publish evidence across all contexts, even if they're underfunded, and advocate for flexible financing that follows learning outcomes rather than headlines. So in the end, real accountability is to the children that we serve and not the signed contracts.
I would like to end by turning to us, people who wish to live in peace. What can each of us do to promote peace and education in everyday life? And what message would you like to leave listeners of this interview?
I think peace and education start long before a ceasefire or a classroom. They start in how we choose to see others. Even small acts like listening without judgment, supporting education initiatives, challenging stereotypes, and all of these are forms of peace building. And if there's one thing I've learned is that hope isn't naive at all. It's practical, and it's the only way that people rebuild themselves through after war.
Thank you. Thank you for those wise words. And I have one more thing that just came to my mind. Maybe there is a question that you wish people will be asking more often. Or maybe there is something I should have asked you.
Yes.
What is missing? Tell me.
I like this question, Chris. Thanks for bringing it in. I think that often when speaking about edtech or digital personalized learning, we miss questions around the end users who are children. We always talk about the platforms, the games, the programs themselves, and how do they serve children and all the technicalities around it and all the work that we do. But I rarely hear questions about children themselves. Their experience. And as much as evidence supports and it actually leads our work, but also there's, for example, a lot of qualitative data that comes from children sharing their experiences about what they want, how do they see things. And these are the most crucial to me. Again, at the end, they are the end users. So yeah, a lot of our focus should be around them and how do they also feel, not only how they are navigating through these tools, but how does it make them feel and what do they want to see in these platforms.
And maybe you've seen like a vivid example of your work. Maybe you've seen a child that was raised in the crisis area, and thanks to education, it outgrew from that and it escaped that. Not only with your tools, but with education in general. Maybe can you share such an example?
My example would be on Can't Wait to Learn, because it was a powerful, really powerful story. And I shared it last year at the acceptance event for the Eden Prize, because that's a story that would never leave me. And it's a story of a Syrian refugee girl called Fatima, who escaped war in Syria through very harsh conditions, coming all the way to Lebanon through the borders. And then realizing that she's coming to a tent where she will share one room with all of her siblings, realizing that she's never gonna have the life that she used to live, away from her friends, away from her classmates, teachers, neighborhood, which was itself a shock. And then few years later, similar to the story that I shared about my mother, all that she could start hearing is talks about her marriage being a teenager. And it was literally that time that Can't Wait to Learn was brought into this informal tented settlement. And Fatima was able to access the reading and the math games. And that's when it was a changing point in her life. It was a sense of hope for her about changing her future. And this was the case. I try to follow up. It's hard sometimes to follow up, especially with families moving around, and especially now with the big number of returnees to Syria. But Fatima is one of the success stories that makes me hopeful about millions of other girls and how education can really bring change into their lives.
That's a moving story. That's a moving story. And I guess that are moments that helps you with all this burden that you have on you, and gives you hope and gives you energy to continue your work.
That's right.
Well, thank you for this interview. My guest was Marwa Zahr. Thank you, and hope to have more as engaged people in education as you are.
Thank you, Chris. And it was a pleasure joining your podcast. Thanks.